podcast is brought to you by LMU Munich.
Yeah, welcome again. I will open this second talk of Professor Brandon. He will continue his reading of Hegel's introduction, and today will be the second part of his lecture with the title Representation and the Experience of Error, a functionalist approach to the distinction between appearance and reality. Please.
Thank you. Well, it's a hardy group that came back after the first lecture. I appreciate it. My lecture today is in two parts. The first one, I want to talk about strategy, and in the second half, I'll talk about how I think Hegel implements that strategy. I began my previous lecture by formulating a central criterion of adequacy for theories of conceptual content that Hegel sees as put in place by the crucial role that those theories play in theories of knowledge. He opens his introduction to the phenomenology by insisting that our semantic theory must not already doom us to epistemological skepticism. Our understanding of discursive contentfulness must at least leave open the possibility that by undertaking conceptually contentful commitments, we can, in some cases, if all goes well, come to know how things really are. He then argues that that condition cannot be met by any account that opens up a gulf of intelligibility, separating how things subjectively appear to us, how they are for consciousness, from how they objectively are in themselves. Modern epistemological theories since Descartes have understood knowledge as the product of two factors: the knower's grasp of subjective thoughts and those thoughts' representational relations to objective things. Knowers' cognitive relations to those represented things are accordingly mediated by representings of them. On pain of an infinite regress, the relation between knowers and their representings cannot in general be understood as themselves mediated and representational. At least some of the representings must be grasped immediately in the sense of non-representationally. I don't think that Hegel rejects as in principle broken-backed all epistemological theories that exhibit this two-stage representational structure, though some of his rhetoric invites us to think otherwise. Rejecting theories of this form is not an essential element, and certainly not the essential element, in the meta-conceptual revolution from thinking in terms of categories with the structure of Verstand to thinking in terms of categories with the structure of Vernunft, which he's recommending. Rather, Hegel begins the phenomenology proper with the claim that the two-stage representational epistemological explanatory strategy leads inexorably to skeptical conclusions if it's combined with a particular auxiliary hypothesis concerning the difference between representings and representeds, one that is tempting and in many ways natural. This is the idea that only representings, appearances, phenomena, are in conceptual shape, while what's represented by them, reality, noumena, is not. On such a view, cognitive processes must transform or map non-conceptual reality into or onto conceptual representations, since the representational relations those processes institute relate non-conceptual representeds to conceptual representings. Getting this picture in view is, I take it, the point of Hegel's metaphor of knowing as an instrument or a medium in the opening paragraphs of the introduction. The culprit, the semantic assumption that threatens to enforce epistemological skepticism by excavating a gulf of intelligibility between thought and the world thought about, is the idea that only what we think, and not the world we think about, is conceptually articulated. The constructive suggestion that Hegel offers as an alternative to this assumption is a radically new, non-psychological conception of the conceptual. According to this conception, to be conceptually contentful is to stand in relations of material incompatibility, he says determinate negation, and material consequence, he says mediation, to other such contentful items. I call this a non-psychological conception of the conceptual because it can be detached from consideration of the processes or practices of applying concepts in judgment and intentional action. Objective states of affairs and properties, too, stand to one another in relations of material incompatibility and consequence, and are accordingly intelligible as already in conceptual shape, quite apart from any relations they might stand in to the cognitive and practical activities of knowing and acting subjects. Indeed, if objective states of affairs and properties did not stand to one another in such relations, they would not be intelligible as so much as determinate. We could not then make any sense of the idea that there is some definite way that the world actually is. For that idea essentially involves the contrast with other ways the world might be, other properties that objects might have. And the contrasts in virtue of which states of affairs and properties are determinate must involve modally exclusive differences, as well as mere differences. Differences like it's impossible for a piece of pure copper to remain solid at temperatures above 1085 degrees C, not just red and square are different but compatible properties. This non-psychological conception of the conceptual is not elaborated in the introduction itself. Rather, it's the principal topic of the succeeding chapters on consciousness. I nonetheless discussed it in my first lecture because it's important to understand how Hegel proposes to avoid the danger of excavating a gulf of intelligibility, separating subjective conceptual representings from objective non-conceptual representeds. It's the danger of excavating such a gulf in the semantic theory of representation that he sees as potentially fatal to the epistemological enterprise. If the process of knowing must span such a gap, then Hegel thinks the possibility of genuine knowledge, knowledge of how things are in themselves, not just of how they are for consciousness, will be ruled out in principle as unintelligible. Conceptual realism about the objective world, understood in terms of his new non-conceptual conception of the conceptual, is Hegel's alternative response. As I read it, the job of the last two-thirds of the introduction is to sketch a way of thinking about representation once the two-stage representational semantic model has been shorn of the objectionable collateral commitment to understanding representing as relating conceptual representings to non-conceptual representeds. This means showing how to satisfy two of the key criteria of adequacy that I identified in my previous lecture. The mode of presentation condition, the MPC, requires an account of what it is to be, or even to purport to be, a representing of some represented, an appearance of something. Satisfying this condition is explaining what representation is. Laying out the structure and rationale of Hegel's account of representational purport and success will also shed light on the second desideratum. The rational constraint condition, the RCC, requires that we explain how what knowing subjects, consciousness, is talking or thinking about what's represented can provide reasons for what they say or think about it. Explaining the account of representation Hegel sketches in the introduction and how it proposes to satisfy these conditions is the task I take on in this lecture. Now, our ordinary pre-systematic, non-theoretical thought and talk about thinking and talking distinguishes between what we're thinking or saying on the one hand and what we're thinking or talking about on the other. We may accordingly say that intentionality, the contentfulness of thought and talk, has two dimensions: what we express when we say or think something and what we represent in doing so. We can say both Kant came to believe that Lampl was betraying him, and Kant believed of his faithful servant that he was betraying Kant. In the first, the declarative sentence that follows the that expresses the content of the belief, and in the second, the noun phrase within the scope of the of says what the belief is about. What I've called Hegel's non-psychological conception of the conceptual, which construes conceptual contentfulness as consisting in standing in relations of material incompatibility and consequence, is a model of what one says or thinks, the first dimension of intentionality or contentfulness, what we could call that intentionality. For that reason, I'm going to call this the conceptual dimension of intentional contentfulness. The question on the table now is how he understands the other representational dimension, what we could call of intentionality. The empiricists had pursued an order of explanation that begins with representational contentfulness and seeks, in effect, to understand and explain conceptual contentfulness more generally in terms of it. And we see this order of explanation pursued in our own day. As I understand him, Hegel pursues a complementary order of explanation. The project he outlines in the introduction is to explain the notion of representation in terms of his non-psychological concept of conceptual contentfulness. In what follows, I want to explain how I understand his strategy for pursuing this conceptualist order of explanation. For one of the principal lessons I think we ought to learn from Hegel for our thinking today concerns his working out of an alternative to the representationalist order of explanation of the two dimensions of intentionality, which has dominated philosophical semantics of the philosophical tradition of the past century, which we inherit, as much as it did the philosophical tradition that Hegel inherited. Hegel has a big new idea about how to explain representational content in terms of conceptual content, understood non-psychologically as he does in terms of articulation by relations of material incompatibility and consequence. The way he fills in that conceptualist idea is best understood as a way of combining and jointly developing two Kantian ideas. The first is Kant's normative account of judgment. What distinguishes judgments from the responses of merely natural creatures is that we're in a distinctive way responsible for our judgments. They express commitments of ours. Judging, for Kant, is a kind of endorsement, an exercise of the subject's authority. Responsibility, commitment, endorsement, authority, these are all normative concepts. Kant understands concepts as what he calls functions of judgment, in the sense that the concepts applied in a judgment determine what the subject has made himself responsible for, committed itself to, endorsed or invested with its authority. In judging, subjects normatively bind themselves by rules, that is, concepts, that determine the nature and the extent of their commitment. By pursuing an account with this shape, Kant makes urgent the question of how to understand the normative bindingness, his Verbindlichkeit, of the concepts applied in judging. Well, the early modern tradition, beginning with Descartes, had worried about our grip on concepts. For Kant, the problem becomes understanding their normative grip on us. What is it to be committed to or responsible for the claim that be? The second Kantian idea on which Hegel's conceptualist approach to the representational dimension of intentionality is based is that the responsibility in question should be understood as a kind of task responsibility. It's the responsibility to do something. What one is responsible for doing is, in committing oneself to P, is integrating the new commitment into the constellation of prior commitments so as to sustain its exhibition of the kind of unity distinctive of apperception. Apperception is cognitive or sapient awareness, awareness that can amount to knowledge. Apperceiving, for Kant, is judging. Judgment is the form of apperception because judgments are the smallest unit for which one can take cognitive responsibility. This integration is a species of the genus Kant calls synthesis, which is why the structural unity in question is a synthetic unity of apperception. This integrative task responsibility has three dimensions: critical, ampliative, and justificatory. These are species of rational obligations, for they're articulated by which commitments serve as reasons for and against which others. One's critical integrative synthetic task responsibility is to reject commitments that are materially incompatible with other commitments one has acknowledged. One's ampliative integrative synthetic task responsibility is to acknowledge commitments that are material consequences of other commitments one has acknowledged. And one's justificatory integrative synthetic task responsibility is to be able to provide reasons for the commitments one has acknowledged by citing other commitments one acknowledges, of which they are material consequences. These are ought-to-dos that correspond to the ought-to-bes that one's cognitive commitments, judgments, or beliefs ought to be consistent, complete, and justified. They are norms of rationality. When explicitly acknowledged, They're the norms of Kantian systematicity. Since judging consists in implicitly committing oneself to fulfill the critical, ampliative, and justificatory integrative synthetic task responsibilities, in judging at all, one implicitly undertakes the rational systematic commitments. Collectively, they define the rational, normative, synthetic unity of apperception. Hegel sees that this account of the activity of judging has immediate consequences for our understanding of the contents judged, for what one has taken responsibility for, committed oneself to in judging that P. The rational articulation of the normative synthetic integrative task responsibility Kant identifies as a kind of endorsement distinctive of judging means that we can understand judgeable contents in terms of what we're doing in judging. For those contents must determine the rational relations such judgeable contents stand in to one another. What's a reason for and against what? The critical integrative synthetic task responsibility requires that judgeable contents stand to one another in relations of material incompatibility. The ampliative and justificatory integrative synthetic task responsibilities require that judgeable contents stand to one another in relations of material consequence. And that's to say that judgeable contents must have conceptual content in the sense that Hegel himself endorses. So that concept of the conceptual Hegel sees as already implicit in Kant's account of judging. Hegel extracts his conception of conceptual contentfulness from what's required to synthesize a constellation of commitments exhibiting the rational normative unity distinctive of apperception. This is a broadly functionalist idea, for it's the idea of understanding judgeable contents in terms of the role judgings play in the integrative process that is Kantian apperceiving. This functionalist explanatory strategy is of the first importance in understanding not only Hegel's conception of the expressive dimension of intentionality, but also the way he builds on that to offer an account of the representational dimension of intentionality. What is functionally reconstructed in terms of role in the synthesis of apperception is, of course, at most part of Kant's understanding of the conceptual. For this abstract, top-down approach to concepts does not essentially depend on their contrast with and collaboration with intuitions. Kant himself would insist that for this reason, understanding concepts solely in terms of relations of material incompatibility and consequence, apart from any relation to intuitions, must be a purely formal one. So conceived, concepts would be empty in the sense of being devoid of representational content. But from the point of view of Hegel's conceptualist explanatory strategy, this conception of the expressive or conceptual dimension of intentionality in fact provides the raw materials in terms of which the representational dimension is to be understood. Hegel sees that Kant envisages a normative approach not only to the expressive conceptual dimension of intentionality, the de dicto, that intentionality, but also to the representational dimension, de re, of intentionality. The conceptual content of a judgment is what one makes oneself responsible for in judging, and its representational content, what is represented by it, is what one makes oneself responsible to. For Hegel's Kant, we've seen, being responsible for a judgment to the effect that P consists in being responsible for integrating it into the constellation of one's prior commitments so as to sustain the rational normative unity characteristic of apperception. What the judgment is about, what's represented by it, is what exercises a distinctive kind of authority over assessments of its correctness, as, we might want to say, a representing of that represented. Something, paradigmatically a judging, is intelligible as being a representing just insofar as it's responsible for its correctness to something that thereby counts as represented by it. In Kant's terms, the objective form of judgment is what he calls the object equals X, which every judgment as such is responsible to for its correctness. The subjective form of judgment, the I think, which can accompany every judging, marks the knower who is responsible for the judgment. that is, responsible for integrating it with the others for which that knower takes the same kind of responsibility. In the form in which this thought appears in Hegel's introduction, represented objects are what serve as a normative standard, Maßstab, for assessments of commitments that count as representing those objects just in virtue of that constellation of authority and responsibility. Hegel's big new idea is to apply the functionalist explanatory strategy, which looked to normative role in the synthetic integrative activity of judging for understanding the conceptual dimension of judgeable contents, also for the understanding of the representational dimension of content. That is, he looks to what knowing subjects need to do in order thereby to count as acknowledging the authority of something to serve as a standard for assessing the correctness of a judgment in order to understand representational relations. If he can exhibit that kind of doing as an aspect of the synthetic integrative activity in terms of which the conceptual dimension of content is explained, he will have carried out the conceptualist explanatory strategy of understanding the representational dimension of intentionality in terms of the expressive conceptual dimension. He will have given a functionalist explanation of intentionality in terms of that intentionality. I take it that the main task of the last two-thirds of the introduction to the phenomenology is to sketch this way of working out the conceptualist explanatory strategy for understanding the relations between the two dimensions of intentionality. The logical flow, as I see it, consists of 7 steps. First, the starting point is Kant's normative conception of judgment, which sees judging as endorsing, committing oneself to, taking responsibility for some judgeable content. Second, this idea is made more definite by the Kantian account of judging as integrating a new commitment into a constellation of prior commitments, so as to maintain the rational normative unity distinctive of apperception. Third, that idea in turn is filled in by understanding the synthetic integrative activity as having the tripartite structure of satisfying critical, ampliative, and justificatory task responsibilities. Fourth, to this idea is conjoined the functionalist strategy of understanding judgeable contents as articulated by the relations they must stand in order to play their role in that activity as what one is endorsing, committing oneself to, or taking responsibility for. Fifth, in the light of the tripartite structure of synthesizing a constellation of commitments exhibiting the rational unity distinctive of apperception, that is, of intentionality, this thought yields a conception of judgeable contents as articulated by rational relations of material incompatibility, appealed to by the critical task responsibility, and material consequence, appealed to by the ampliative and justificatory task responsibilities. The result is Hegel's conception of conceptual contentfulness in terms of determinate negation and mediation. The strategy for implementing the conceptualist order of explanation is to treat this account of the expressive conceptual dimension of intentionality both as providing the raw materials and as providing the model for an account of the representational dimension of intentionality and conceptual content. So, sixth, alongside Kant's normative conception of judgment, a normative conception of representation is discerned. A judgment counts as representing some represented object insofar as it's responsible to that object for its correctness, insofar as that object exercises authority over or serves as a standard for assessments of its correctness. Seventh, and finally, the strategy is then to apply the functionalist idea again to understand representational content in terms of what's required to serve as a normative standard for assessments of the correctness of judgments as an aspect of the synthetic process of integrating those commitments into constellations of antecedent commitments exhibiting the rational unity distinctive of apperception. Well, that's my account of the Hegelian explanatory strategy that I see is in play in the last two-thirds of the introduction. Now I want to talk about how he implements that. How does he actually tell a story that satisfies that strategic plan? The task of making sense of the representational dimension of intentionality according to the conceptualist functionalist strategy, is explaining what it is for some judgeable conceptual content, articulated by its relations of material incompatibility and consequence to other such contents, to function as representing some worldly state of affairs. Saying what role in the synthetic integrative process of judging a judgeable content must play in order to count as purporting to represent something is then satisfying what in my first lecture I called the mode of presentation condition, the MPC. For it's saying what it is to be, or to purport to be, a mode of presentation of something else, a representing of something represented. Hegel's preferred way of talking about what I've called representings is what things are for consciousness. What things are for consciousness purports to be the appearance of a reality, what things are in themselves. Satisfying the MPC is saying what it is for something to show up as an appearance of something. The representing represented, appearance reality, what things are for consciousness, what things are in themselves, and the certainty truth distinctions also line up for Hegel with the Kantian phenomena noumena distinction. The question Hegel is asking is, what is it for something to be something for consciousness? This is asking the deepest and most important question about the representational dimension of intentionality. Hegel is not at all presupposing the notion of things being something for consciousness. It's not one of his primitives. Rather, he offers a sophisticated functionalist account of representational purport and representational content that's modeled on, embedded in, and a development of the functionalist account of propositional content in terms of the activity of judging that he sees as implicit in Kant's way of proceeding. There, Hegel answers the question that would later be put as that of specifying the distinctive unity of the proposition. He answers it holistically in terms of standing to other judgeable contents in relations of material incompatibility and material consequence. Those relations show up as rational relations because they articulate what judgments serve as reasons for and against what others. The unity of the proposition is understood functionally in terms of the synthetic unity of a constellation of commitments that's characteristic of apperception. The dynamic unity created and sustained by integrating new commitments with old ones, subject to the triadic, systematic, critical, ampliative, and justificatory task responsibilities. That the unity of propositional content can be so understood in terms of the unity that defines the rational norms that must govern what one does in order for such doings to count as judgings, having contents exhibiting the unity characteristic of the propositional, is what it means to say that in the end, as Kant says in the Transcendental Deduction, there is only one unity, ultimately the synthetic unity of apperception. And the question is how Hegel can apply that model to the representational dimension of intentionality. We've seen that the first piece of the puzzle is the idea that for something to be something for consciousness is to be understood in normative terms of the distinctive kind of authority it exercises over assessments of the correctness of the judgments consciousness consists in. Judgments must be responsible to what is represented for their correctness, for them to be intelligible as representing it, being about it, being an appearance of it. As Hegel puts the point, what's represented must serve as a normative standard for judgings. The next question is how this thought can be operationalized in a functionalist spirit. That is, understood in terms of what one must do to count as acknowledging that authority, acknowledging the responsibility of what things are for consciousness, which is to say judgments, to what things are in themselves. Consciousness itself must take its judgments to be representations of some reality. That is, to point beyond themselves to something that they answer to for their correctness. Otherwise, it would not be taking it that in judging, a consciousness is taking a stand on how things are in themselves. Its judgments would not be how things really are for consciousness. What we must understand then is the sense in which, as Hegel says, quote, consciousness provides itself with its own standard, end quote. how, quote, in what consciousness within its own self designates as the in itself, or the true, we have the standard by which consciousness itself proposes to measure its knowledge, quote. How is it that, quote, the difference between the in itself and the for itself is already present in the fact that consciousness knows an object at all? Something is to it, the in itself, but the knowledge or the being of the object for consciousness is to it still another moment, end of the quote. The distinction between what things are in themselves and what they are for consciousness, Hegel is saying, must itself be something to consciousness. This passage marks an absolutely crucial, if seldom acknowledged, distinction between things being something for consciousness and things being something to consciousness. It's easy to miss this distinction because unlike the phrases for consciousness, Vorbewusstsein, in themselves, an sich, to consciousness is expressed without an explicit proposition. In the dative construction, ihm. What Hegel tells us is something to consciousness is just the distinction between what things are for consciousness and what they are in themselves. Now, I take it that what something is for consciousness is, in the first instance, the content of a judgment, something that is explicit. Judgeable contents are explicit in the sense of being thinkable and stateable in declarative sentences, or that clauses. They're propositional contents. As we've seen, Hegel understands such contents in terms of relations of material incompatibility, and hence material consequence, they stand into one another. And again, he understands those relations in terms of the role judgeable contents play in the rational synthetic process of integration and rectification of commitments so as to maintain the unity characteristic of perception. By contrast, what things are to consciousness is a functional matter of how they are implicitly taken or practically treated by consciousness. In what it does, consciousness, Hegel is saying, practically distinguishes between what things are for it and what they are in themselves, between appearance and reality. Consciousness, he says, is their comparison. We must understand how what consciousness does, that is essential to its being intelligible as consciousness, can be understood as practically acknowledging this distinction. This will be understanding how, quote, consciousness is, on the one hand, consciousness of the object, and on the other, consciousness of itself, consciousness of what is to it the true, and consciousness of its knowledge of the truth, end of the quote. What consciousness as such does is judge, engage in the synthetic integrative activity that creates and maintains the synthetic unity of apperception. So the distinction between appearance and reality, what things are for consciousness and what they are in themselves, representings and representeds, must somehow be intelligible in terms of functional roles with respect to that activity. What Hegel calls natural consciousness itself does not need to have these metaconceptual concepts, does not need to be able to apply them explicitly in judgments. But we, the phenomenological consciousness, who are thinking about its activity, must be able to attribute to natural consciousness a grasp of what these concepts make explicit, a grasp that is implicit in what consciousness does. The normative construal of representation teaches us that the role something must play in practice in order to be functioning as a reality that's represented by or appearing in a judgment is that of a normative standard for the assessment of its correctness. What in the first lecture I called the rational constraint condition tells us that what serves as a standard of assessment of judgeable contents must be able to serve as a reason for the assessment. And this is to say that it must, at least in principle, be available to consciousness as a reason. To be serviceable as a reason, what plays the role of a standard of assessment must be in conceptual shape. It must stand to representings and representables in relations of material incompatibility and consequence. That's what's required for it to be able to serve as a reason for or against judgments, a standard with respect to which they can be assessed as correct or incorrect. With that thought, we arrive at the crux of Hegel's functionalist account of representational purport. Hegel's term for the process by which new commitments are integrated into a constellation of old ones is experience, Erfahrung. The aspect of that process on which his account of the representational purport of judgeable contents turns is the critical one, in which incompatibilities that result from adding a new judgment are acknowledged and resolved. The systematic normative obligation along this dimension is a task responsibility, the responsibility to do something. What one is obliged to do is to restore the synthetic unity characteristic of apperception by repairing the incoherence that results when a subject finds itself with incompatible commitments. This process is the experience of error. Consider an example. A naive subject looks at a stick half submerged in the water of a pond and perceptually acquires a belief that the stick is bent. Upon pulling it out, she acquires the belief that it's straight. Throughout, she's believed that it's rigid and that removing it from water won't change its shape. These judgments are jointly incompatible. Acknowledging that is acknowledging that a mistake has been made. Those acknowledgments are acknowledgments of the practical responsibility to restore compatibility to one's commitments, that is, to fulfill one's critical task responsibility. What one must do is reject or modify at least one of the commitments in the offending constellation. Suppose our subject gives up the belief that the stick is bent, keeping the belief that it's straight, as well as the other collateral commitments. Our subject might have made the choice she did concerning what to retain and what to reject in the light of her belief that she's much more experienced and reliable at visually judging shapes looked at through air or water than through both. Notice first that in treating the two shape commitments as materially incompatible, at least in the context of collateral commitments to rigidity and shape constancy, the subject is implicitly treating them as having a common subject, as being about one and the same object. For commitments to stick A being bent and to stick B being straight are not incompatible. It's only if it's the same stick to which one is attributing those incompatible properties that the resulting judgeable contents are incompatible with one another. Hegel discusses this issue at some length in the perception chapter of the Phenomenology. Taking two commitments to be incompatible by acknowledging in practice the obligation to revise at least one of them is treating them as being about one object and to be attributing incompatible properties to it. In other words, it's treating them as representings of a common represented. Practically acknowledging the incompatibility of two commitments involves a kind of representational triangulation. It's implicitly treating them as sharing a topic, as being about the same thing. To say that this acknowledgement of common representational purport is implicit is to say that the representational purport is acknowledged in what the subject does, rather than explicitly as the propositional content of a judgment to the effect that these different senses, conceptual contents articulated by relations of material incompatibility and consequence, pick out the same referent. That is, it's a matter of what those commitments are to consciousness, not what they are for consciousness. The stick is both bent and straight for consciousness, but the incompatibility of those commitments is, in the simplest case, only something to consciousness. This is a point about the first stage of the process that is the experience of error, acknowledgement of the material incompatibility of some commitments the subject has made. At this stage, the incompatible commitments are all on a level. No invidious assessments of their relative authority or credibility have yet been made. What I've said so far is that even at this stage, we can understand an acknowledgement of the joint representational purport of two commitments as being implicit in the practical acknowledgement of their material incompatibility. This purely formal dimension of practical representational purport is complemented by another, richer dimension that emerges only at the next stage in the experience of error. For acknowledgement of incompatibility, that is, of the presence of some error or other among the commitments being taken to be mutually incompatible, is to be followed by revision of at least some of those commitments. The second, rectification stage of the experience of error consists in doing what at the first stage one acknowledged one's practical obligation to do, namely to repair the acknowledged incompatibility by revising or rejecting some of the offending commitments. In the example, in relinquishing the bent stick belief and retaining the straight stick belief, the subject is treating the first presenting as presenting a mere appearance, and the second as presenting the corresponding reality. For at this stage in the experience of error, the mistake has been localized and identified. The problem, the subject takes it, is the bent stick commitment. It's in error. Rejecting it is practically taking it not to express how things really are. For endorsing a judgeable content is what one must do in order thereby to be taking or treating it in practice as expressing how things really are. The subject had previously practically accorded that status to the bent stick judgment. Repudiating that prior commitment is taking it no longer to deserve that status. The subject takes it to have been revealed by its collision with other commitments as merely purporting to express how things really are, that is, as being a mere appearance. Furthermore, the triangulation point ensures that the rejected bent stick judgment is practically construed not just as an appearance, but as an appearance of the reality presented by the retained commitment. What appeared as bent, the stick, has been revealed as really straight. In the experience of error, both the straight stick and the bent stick commitments are practically taken or treated as modes of presentation of a reality, the stick, one veridically representing and one misrepresenting it. Both of these stages of the process that is the experience of error, the acknowledgement of incompatibility and its rectification, contribute to the satisfaction of the mode of presentation condition on a construal of intentional content. For the way judgments function, the roles they play, in these phases of the experience of error, show what it is one must do in order thereby to count as acknowledging in practice the representational dimension of conceptual content. They show what it is to take or treat judgments in practice as representings or appearances of how some represented thing really is. In the first phase of the experience of error, the authority of the straight stick belief collides with that of the bent stick belief. In the second phase, the authority of the straight stick belief is endorsed, while that of the bent stick belief is rejected. In the context of collateral beliefs concerning rigidity, what can change the shape of rigid objects, and the relative reliability of visual perception under various conditions, the straight stick belief is accepted as a standard for the assessment of the correctness, the veridicality of the bent stick belief. Since they're incompatible, the latter is rejected as incorrect according to that standard. The bent stick belief is assessed as responsible to the constellation of commitments that includes the straight stick belief. All of this is to say that as presented in the straight stick judgment, the straight stick is performing the normative functional office characteristic of the reality represented by some representing. It's being practically treated as being, that is, it is to consciousness, an authoritative standard for assessments of the correctness of representings that count as being about it just in virtue of being responsible to it for such assessments. So, when we look at the role played by various commitments in the experience of error, we see that the mode of presentation condition is satisfied in the sense required by the normative construal of representing. Furthermore, the rational constraint condition is also satisfied by understanding representational purport functionally in terms of the role conceptually articulated judgeable contents play in processes that have the structure of the experience of error. For in the context of the constellation of collateral commitments in our example, the straight stick belief provides a reason for rejecting the bent stick belief. The collision between the two is rationally resolved. Belief in the differential reliability of visual perception under the conditions that led to the endorsement of the bent stick and the straight stick perceptual judgments conjoined with the straight stick belief, constitute an argument against the bent stick belief. In undergoing the experience of error, our subject in practice treats reality, the straight stick, as providing rational constraint on assessments of various appearances as veridical. In proceeding this way, the subject in practice takes or treats the bent stick belief as expressing just what things are for consciousness, and the straight stick belief is expressing what things are in themselves. And these statuses, in turn, are what the beliefs are to consciousness, practically or implicitly. For the subject of the experience of error, natural consciousness, need not explicitly deploy concepts of reality and appearance, represented and representing, what things are in themselves and what things are for consciousness, noumena and phenomena, in order for what it does in retaining one of the contextually, materially incompatible dyad of commitments and rejecting the other, to be intelligible as practically taking or treating one as presenting how things really are, and the other as presenting a mere appearance. One is, to consciousness, what the stick is in itself, straight, and the other is, to consciousness, what the stick is or was merely for consciousness. That's what Hegel means when he says that, quote, consciousness provides itself with its own standard, close quote. How, quote, in what consciousness within its own self designates as the in itself or the true, we have the standard by which consciousness itself proposes to measure its knowledge, end of the quote. On Hegel's model, the conceptual content shared by representing and represented, appearance and reality, phenomenon and noumenon, commitment and fact, is abstracted from the two different forms that relations of material incompatibility and consequence can take. The subjective form, made explicit by deontic normative vocabulary, and the objective form, made explicit by alethic modal vocabulary. Conceptual content is essentially, and not just accidentally, what can take these two forms. The central metaphysical concept that incorporates and expresses this point is Hegel's concept of determinate negation. It articulates the sense in which anything, thoughts or facts, properties, conceptual contents, can count as determinate by strongly contrasting with, precluding, excluding other determinants. Remember Spinoza, omnis determinatio est negatio. On the objective side, this means that how things are is essentially also a matter of the structure of its alethic modal relations to what it makes impossible and what it makes necessary. On the subjective side, it means that commitments can be understood as determinate only in the context of the functional role they play in the process of acquiring and revising commitments. For it's that process that's governed by the deontic normative relations of incompatibility and consequence that articulate the conceptual contents of those commitments. One of the things that's always been hard to understand about Hegel's concept of negation, determinate negation, and so his conception of concepts and their contents, is precisely his connection of those traditional logical notions with dynamic categories of movement, process, restlessness. What lies behind it is this connection between incompatibility in the normative sense and the process of commitment acquisition and revision. Hegel regards the subjective articulation of the conceptual content of commitments by deontic normative relations of material incompatibility and consequence, and the objective articulation of the conceptual content of commitments by alethic modal relations of material incompatibility and consequence as two sides of one coin, two aspects of one conception. His substantive claim is that his concepts of determinate negation and conceptual content do not equivocate. Rather, they have a fine structure that's articulated by the relations between the two intimately related forms, subjective and objective, that conceptual contents defined by determinate negation and mediation can take. This claim plays a central role in his strategy of understanding the subjective and objective sides of the intentional nexus of knowledge by abstracting them as complementary aspects of conceptual content, a strategy he contrasts already in the introduction with traditional approaches that seek to take antecedently and independently specified conceptions of subject and object and somehow bolt them together to get an intelligible picture of their intensional relations. That approach, he claims, is doomed so long as a psychological conception of the conceptual, and hence of the intelligible, restricts conceptual content to the subjective side of what then inevitably appears as a gulf of intelligibility, separating knowing and acting subjects from the objective world they know about and act on and in. But how are we to understand the conception of conceptual content, articulated by relations of determinate negation and mediation, as amphibious between its two forms, subjective normative and objective modal? This question obviously goes to the heart of our understanding of Hegel's idealism. I think it should be understood in terms of two claims. First, deontic normative vocabulary is a pragmatic metavocabulary for alethic modal vocabulary. Second, as a consequence, there's a kind of sense-dependence relation between these vocabularies. On the first point, deontic normative vocabulary lets one say what one must do in order thereby to be saying what alethic modal vocabulary lets one say. For what one must do in order to count as grasping the contents expressed by alethic modal vocabulary, by the claims that it's impossible that both P and Q, or that if P then necessarily R, is in practice to take or treat commitments to P and Q as normatively incompatible, and commitment to P as normatively entailing commitment to R. It's only by knowing how to accord with the norms expressed in the deontic vocabulary that one can count as able to understand and apply modal vocabulary. Practically treating one's commitments as standing in those normative relations to one another is implicitly understanding them as commitments concerning what is objectively impossible and necessary. That is, understanding them as appearances of a reality articulated by such alethic modal relations. As we've seen, engaging in the experience of error, governed by practical norms that respect deontic relations of incompatibility, is what taking or treating one's commitments as appearances, representings of some represented reality, consists in. The deontic normative vocabulary in this way plays the expressive role of being a pragmatic metavocabulary for alethic modal vocabulary, means that one cannot understand alethic modal vocabulary, cannot deploy it with understanding, unless one has mastered the normatively governed practices made explicit by deontic normative vocabulary. This is a claim about practically grasping what's expressed by alethic modality, alethic modal vocabulary, about what one must be able to do in order to say what it says. It's not a claim about what must be true for what one says using that modal vocabulary to be true. That is, the claim is not that unless some claims formulable in deontic normative vocabulary were true, no claims formulable in alethic modal vocabulary could be true. It's not and does not entail the claim that unless some concept users could apply normative vocabulary, no modal claims would be true. The claim is that unless one practically understands what's said by normative vocabulary, that is, unless one can do the things, engage in the practices that are specifiable in normative vocabulary, one cannot understand what's said by modal vocabulary. That is, the claim is that there's a kind of sense dependence of modal vocabulary on what's expressed by normative vocabulary, not a kind of reference dependence. The distinction between sense dependence and reference dependence can be made clear by an example that has nothing to do with either normativity or modality. Regardless of whether or not it would be a good way to think about the concept of beauty, we could define a response-dependent property, I'll call it beauty star, by stipulating that some object or situation counts as beautiful star just in case it would, under suitable circumstances, produce a response of pleasure in a suitable subject suitably exposed to it. Then, the property of being beautiful star is sense-dependent on that of pleasure. You can't understand the concept beautiful star unless one understood the concept pleasure, for one is defined in terms of the other. But notice that it does not at all follow that something could not be beautiful star unless something responded to it with pleasure. On this definition, there were sunsets that were beautiful star before there were any suitable pleasure-capable responders, and they would still have been beautiful star even if there never had been such responders. For it still could be the case that if there were such responders present, they would respond or would have responded with pleasure. In just the same way, if we define a planet or a star as supraterran, just in case it has a mass more than twice that of the Earth, we're not thereby committing ourselves to denying that a planet could have that property in a possible world in which the Earth did not exist. Depending on how they're specified, properties can be sense-dependent on other properties, as beautiful star is on pleasure, and supraterran is on the property of having at least twice the mass of the Earth, without being reference-dependent on them. That is, something can exhibit a property P that's sense-dependent but not reference-dependent on a property P prime in a world in which nothing exhibits the property P prime. The claimed dependence of modal properties on norm-governed activities of accepting and rejecting commitments is of the sense-dependence rather than the reference-dependence kind. The objective world would still be conceptually structured in the sense of consisting of facts about objects and their properties and relations, articulated by alethic modal relations of relative compossibility and necessitation, even in worlds that never included knowing and acting subjects who applied normatively articulated concepts in undertaking and rejecting commitments. The mind dependence of the objective world asserted by this dimension of Hegel's idealism, we might call it objective idealism, is not the objectionable Berkeleian reference dependence kind. Kant called it subjective idealism, but of the much more plausible, or at least colorable, sense dependence kind. We can understand and describe possible worlds without subjects, to whom normative vocabulary applies, as nonetheless making applicable alethic modal vocabulary. But our capacity to make sense of such possibilities depends on our being able to engage in practices that are made explicit by the application of deontic normative vocabulary. The sort of model that Hegel constructs to contrast with two-stage representational models committed to a strong difference of intelligibility between representings and representeds depends on an account of conceptual contentfulness committed to the amphibiousness of conceptual content between a subjective form articulated by deontic normative relations of incompatibility and consequence, and an objective form articulated by alethic modal relations of incompatibility and consequence. The relation of correspondence between them is that of a pragmatic metavocabulary that induces a kind of practical sense dependence. According to this model, modal realism entails conceptual realism, which entails objective idealism. Well, I ended my first lecture with a discussion of the two forms of conceptual content, the two forms that conceptual content can be seen to take once we adopt Hegel's non-psychological conception of it as articulated by relations of material incompatibility and consequence, namely the subjective and objective forms. It's this conception that is to make it possible for us to avoid excavating a gulf of intelligibility between knower and known, appearance and reality, representings and representeds, in our semantics, a gulf which must then lead inevitably to skepticism in our epistemology. We're now in a position to understand the relation between propositional commitments, judgments, beliefs, thoughts, articulated by normative deontic relations of incompatibility on the subjective side of certainty, what things are for consciousness, and facts and possible states of affairs articulated by alethic modal relations of incompatibility on the objective side of truth, what things are in themselves. We're now in a position to understand that relation as itself a representational one, a matter of representings and representeds. Because we can see how our commitments are intelligible as appearances of an objective reality. That intelligibility is functionalist and pragmatist. Now we know what we must do in order thereby implicitly to be practically taking or treating our commitments as appearances of a reality, so that the distinction between what things are for consciousness and what they are in themselves is something to consciousness. The account I've rehearsed here of representational purport in terms of the experience of error operationalizes what in my first lecture I called the intelligibility of error and the genuine knowledge criteria of epistemological adequacy on semantic accounts of intentional contentfulness and aboutness. This whole lecture has been an extended discussion of how in the same terms the mode of presentation condition can be satisfied, how to understand the representational dimension of intentionality in terms of the expressive conceptual dimension. I've concluded this lecture by talking about how that first dimension, and so the second, can be understood in terms of what one is doing in undergoing the experience of error. That is, I've been talking about how the knowing subject's activity, which is discussed in deontic normative terms of commitment and entitlement, and the subjective aspect of the notion of material incompatibility they articulate, can be understood as involving representational purport, understood as an appearance, what things are for consciousness, of the reality, what things are in themselves, constituted by the objective states of affairs discussed in elethic modal terms of necessity and possibility, and the objective aspect of the notion of material incompatibility that they articulate. What in the first lecture I called the rational constraint condition is the requirement that what's represented be intelligible as providing reasons for assessments of the correctness of representings. It's shown up here as a consequence of the normative construal of representation that Hegel sees as already introduced by Kant. In the context of the account offered here of representational purport, in terms of functional role in cognitive processes characterized by the experience of error, we can see how the reciprocal sense dependence of the subjective and objective dimensions of the meta-concept of material incompatibility, that is, determinate negation, consequent upon deontic normative vocabulary, serving as a pragmatic meta-vocabulary for elethic modal vocabulary, articulates a deep connection between satisfaction of the mode of presentation condition and satisfaction of the rational constraint condition. In the next lecture, I'll further pursue how Hegel's conception of how our grasp of the concept of truth depends on the practical experience of error, and I'll offer detailed readings of some of the most puzzling passages at the end of the introduction.